Hi everyone, I've come across an interesting poll in Ipsos and it's from October 2024, so a few months old. That's a caveat I want to put out there. Since this poll was conducted, there has been a ceasefire and release of hostages, but the way the Middle East is, I'm cautious as to how long this might last. Um, I think anything could trigger the violence again. I would be shocked, pleasantly shocked, if this really held. And there has indeed been violence elsewhere. There's been violence in the West Bank, there's been violence in Lebanon. So for now, at least the war in Gaza has ended. But, you know, when it comes to the Near East, one can be forgiven for being cautious with optimism, because it seems like a perpetual war, unfortunately. But this particular poll has some interesting results, and I think they're worth reading out. Because, I mean, for me personally, I've said this before, I have definitely evolved my stance. After October the 7th, 2023, I was disgusted by what had happened. I still am. It was absolutely morally reprehensible what Hamas done. Barging into the kibbutz communities, slaughtering people in their homes, killing women, children. It was horrendous. And what those hostages have been through is terrible. They're going to need probably years of therapy. One can only imagine the situation. Among those freed was a young British woman, so that was good. But it's going to take a long time for them to rebuild their lives. It's going to also take a long time for Palestinians who've been displaced to rebuild their lives. So I was sympathetic to Israel after October the 7th, but I have to be honest. I found it increasingly difficult to be sympathetic to Israel's policy, Israel's military policy, given the massive destruction that it's caused. Now, I personally do hold Hamas and Hezbollah largely responsible for the escalation of violence, but I also think that Israel's gone well beyond self-defense. I don't accept that this is just about self-defense because there are hawks in Netanyahu's cabinet who, given half a chance, would turn Gaza into real estate. That isn't self-defense. That's going well beyond that. Um, and I do think there is something fundamentally wrong about the mentality that concludes that a Palestinian life is somehow worth less than an Israeli life. If 46,000 Israelis had been killed, it would be a very different tune from, I mean, it would just be a different mentality in terms of the acceptability. I do think there is, I don't want to say racist because that clouds it a bit regarding, ethnicity, but I do think there's a, there's a different mindset when it comes to Israeli civilians and Arab civilians, namely that a lot of pro-Israelis, and I'm not just talking about actual Israelis, I mean pro-Israelis, Britons, and so on, genuinely seem to not care that much about dead Palestinians, and I find that morally reprehensible. I mean, to me, seeing a young woman kidnapped by Hamas gunmen and seeing a Palestinian child pulled from the rubble is just as shocking. But some people think only one of those is worth commentary or worth being outraged about. Um, I really resent this idea that if you criticize Israel, you're somehow pro Hamas. That sort of black and white thinking is not helpful and it's not accurate either. For sure, there are some who are anti Israel who are pro Hamas. That's why I've explicitly never joined a pro Palestinian rally. I do think there are some bad apples in there. I think there's people who have genuinely anti Semitic attitudes and anti UK attitudes, like deeply anti UK attitudes. I have no interest in being part of that faction. But I cannot stay silent with something that I think's wrong. I think the bombing of hospitals, refugee camps is just morally indefensible. Even if there is a Hamas terrorist among them, that doesn't justify wiping out entire families. It just doesn't. Um, that's how I feel about it. Tomorrow marks 80 years since Auschwitz was liberated. a sobering occasion. Um, there will be people exploiting this event on both sides. You know, there will be some saying Israel's behaving just as the Third Reich did. I think that's wrong. But I also think it's wrong for right-wing pro-Israelis to exploit the Holocaust, quite frankly, to use it to try and silence critics of Israel by, equating critics somehow being like the Nazis. I also think it's wrong to compare Israeli policy to the Nazis. I think that's misplaced, but I do think Israel's went too far. Anyway, this is a study. It's from the 4th of October 2024. So um, almost a year, almost on the first anniversary of the attacks. And this is what it concludes. I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but I'll read out a good bit of it. This is what the findings were, that both the Israeli government and Hamas are held responsible for the current conflict in Israel and Gaza. This is British public attitude. 3 in 5 of the UK public, 60%, say Israel's military action in Gaza as part of its conflict with Hamas has gone too far. On that point, are pro-Israelis really going to say that 60% of the British public are Hamas sympathisers? I don't think so. While 3 in 4 Britons, 73%, support an immediate unconditional ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, 60% think it's unlikely this will be achieved before the end of 2024, and indeed, as we know, it was early 2025. The release of all Israeli civilians being held by Hamas and a mutual agreement from both Israel and Hamas that there will be no further future attacks on one another lead as conditions Britons would like to see prioritising negotiations. Well, this is reasonable, common sense. Um, The poll reveals a majority of the UK public consider Israel's military actions to have gone too far. We've already mentioned that, 60%. Um, only 12% believes Israel's military action in Gaza is about right, and 6% think it should go even further. And I have to say, I wonder about that 6%. I think, this term genocide's been thrown around. It's hard not to conclude that that 6% would actually advocate genocide. They'd just like to see every single Palestinian eliminated. Um, and attitudes have changed. Let's see. When asked who they think had a greater deal of responsibility for the current conflict, both Hamas, 55%, and the Israeli government, 57%, so it's roughly equal, are mentioned by a majority of the public, followed by Hezbollah in Lebanon, 39%, and Iran. I would, I personally would hold Iran more culpable. They've definitely been stoking up the tensions in the region. I mean, the Iranian regime is utterly vile. Let's not forget it kills its own people. So pro-Palestinians shouldn't have any sympathy for Iran. The Iranian regime doesn't care about Palestinians. Also, those who cried over the demise of Assad should remember Assad also killed Palestinians, so that should that's important to know. Nasser is held most responsible. The public are divided between the Israeli government 30% and Hamas 27%. Um, this is some evidence of a shift in attitude since last year. Previous polling on this subject, conducted in October 2023, remember that's the same month as the attacks, when Britons were almost twice as likely to hold Hamas most responsible uh, than the Israeli government, although this should be seen as indicative given changes in methodology and question wording. Just 1 in 3, 35% of the UK public think Israel is judged less harshly than another country would be if it were in a similar situation. Conversely, 1 in 4 think Israel is treated more harshly, but only 1 in 4. A further 1 in 5 think Israel is judged about the same. My own view on that is there's few countries in the world are as polarizing. I actually see in some ways both sides. I think there are some Arabs and some Muslims around the world and in the West who do tend to focus only on Israel whilst turning a blind eye to some of the atrocities committed by our Arab dictators. I mean, I do question, mobs in Karachi or Jakarta burning Israeli flags whilst ignoring what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghurs. That is selective outrage. Having said that, there are also pro-Israelis in the West who seem to genuinely think Israel should have a green light to do as it pleases. So in that sense, they're also guilty of singling Israel out, albeit the other way. So in some ways, Israel is just not treated normally by either side. It's either excessively condoned or excessively condemned. Um, but I don't think any country that is killing thousands of civilians as part of a military campaign wouldn't be criticised. I think any country in that situation would. Russia has faced enormous criticism from the West and opposition from the West because of its brutal actions in Ukraine. You know, um, in other conflicts around the world, there's civil conflicts or civil wars, so it's a bit more blurred. In Sudan, for example, at least 50,000 people have been killed in that conflict. Um, it doesn't generate the same sort of attention as the war in the Near East. And that's another thing about this conflict. It gets a lot more coverage than other wars, except perhaps Ukraine. Um, the public is divided as to whether they think the humanitarian impact of the conflict on Palestinian civilians is taken less seriously than the impact of conflict on civilians in other war zones, 32%, whether it's treated about the same, 31%. One in five, 22%, think the impact of the conflict on Palestinian civilians is taken more seriously than those in other war zones. Well, that's an interesting question. There is a lot of attention on Palestinians from a lot of groups, not from right wing newspapers and not from conservatives, but generally there is a lot of focus on it, as opposed to, for example, the plight of people in Haiti or Burma or Sudan. That is true. But maybe the question should be, is the plight of Palestinians treated differently than the plight of Israelis? Maybe that should be the question. 1 year after the start of the conflict in Israel and Gaza, concern among Britons is highest regarding the conflict's impact on regional stability, 83%, and the impact on Palestinian civilians, 81% of the British public have a concern about that. Do not tell me that 81% of the British public are pro-Hamas. It's clear that they aren't. Concern is also high over the impact of the conflict on Israeli civilians, 9%. There is a recognition that Israelis also suffer. Community relations in the UK, 68%, and UK national safety and security, 64%. That is to say, that could spill over on the British streets. Of the areas asked about, the UK public is the least concerned about the impact of the conflict on them personally. Um, Unless you're of Arab or Palestinian descent or a British Jew, you might not care. I care because I care about human rights generally. I care about innocent civilian suffering on both sides. The recent escalation between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon is also a subject of concern for a majority of Britain, 71%. On this subject, almost half, 48%, say Israel's military actions in Lebanon have gone too far, 17% that they are about right, and 8% not far enough, 24% don't know. Though no fieldwork took place before the recent attacks by Iran on Israel. Half of the UK public, 49%, say the UK should be a neutral mediator in the conflict in Israel and Gaza, with a further 14% saying the UK shouldn't be involved at all. Um, the reality is we helped to create the state of Israel, so Britain is never going to be explicitly anti-Israel. Um, but really, Israel's been independent for over 70 years. I don't think we should necessarily simply go blindly along with what America decides and what Israel decides. I do think we need to be a bit more outspoken, as other European countries have been. 16% say the UK should support Palestinians, while 8% say the UK should support Israel. 8%. Just 8% of the British public. Now, it's pretty low for Palestinians as well, but that to me is pretty resounding. There is a clear divide by age. Among over 55, 62% think the UK should be neutral, 13% that it should support Israel, and 6% the Palestinians. Among 18 to 34-year-olds, 31% think the UK should be neutral, 5% that it should support Israel, and 31% the Palestinians. Views on the UK's government in response are still not fully formed, with 40% taking a neutral response and saying it's done neither a good nor bad job. Among those who do give an opinion, more think it is doing a bad job in its response, 36%, and a good job, 14%. Views are similar when asked about the performance of Keir Starmer specifically responding to the conflict. 41% neither good nor bad, 35% bad, 12% good. I do think Starmer's in a difficult position because whatever decision he makes, he's going to be condemned. So I have some sympathy for the position that Starmer's in with that. 3 and 4% of Britain, 73% support an immediate unconditional ceasefire on both sides. To negotiate settlement to the conflict and be reached. The criteria that the UK public feel are most important to be included when negotiating the ceasefire are the release of all Israeli civilians being held hostage by Hamas, that's 53%, a mutual agreement from both Israel and Hamas that there will be no future attacks on one another, 52%, the opening of the Rafah crossing to allow the free flow of aid and supplies into Gaza, and opening negotiations for a two-state solution. I personally would include that Hamas should get rid of its charter that is has genocidal intent towards Israelis and Jews. They need to be legally obliged to get rid of that. But we talk about the Israeli hostages, and that's awful. But there are many Palestinians in Israeli jails on very dubious charges. That shouldn't be overlooked either. They are arguably hostages as well. However, the public is much more pessimistic than optimistic about how they see the conflict playing out over the coming months. 3 and 5, that's 60%, think it's unlikely there will be a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas before the end of the year, with a similar proportion, 55%, thinking it unlikely that a ceasefire will be reached between Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that still hasn't been reached. More than half, 54%, think likely that the conflict will spread to more countries by the end of 2024, compared to 14% who think this is unlikely. Looking further to the future, 62% think it unlikely a lasting resolution will ever be reached between Israel and Palestine, with around 1 in 10, 11%, thinking such a resolution is likely. And Gideon Skinner, the senior director of UK politics at Ipsos, says people in the UK remain very concerned about the conflict between Israel and Gaza, particularly the impact on civilians from both sides. Evidence in high levels of support for an immediate ceasefire, and now augmented by wider concerns about the impact on regional stability within the Middle East, and an expectation that more countries are likely to be drawn into the conflict. Both Hamas and the Israeli government are held responsible for the conflict, but as the year has gone on, there is now widespread concern that the military actions taken by Israel have gone too far, although there is no consensus over whether Israel is judged more harshly than other countries would be in the situation. And the return of Israeli civilians is seen as a key condition of any ceasefire. Closer to home, while there is most support for the UK being a neutral mediator in the conflict, only a minority think the UK government has got the balance right in its response. And although most people do not feel personally affected, there are clear worries about the impact on community relations in the UK, with our data also revealing a clear age divide, with younger generations less sympathetic towards Israel and more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause than older Britons. I'm 39, so I'm not sure where I'd probably be in the middle age group. Not myself as middle aged, but I'm obviously over 34. I wouldn't be overtly pro-Palestinian because I am uncomfortable with the pro-Hamas sentiments that are there. But I just cannot, in good conscience, blindly support this narrative that Israel has a right to do as it pleases under the guise of self-defense. I don't see any moral argument supporting the bombing of hospitals, the bombing of refugee camps, the wiping out of entire families. And even if you say that the figures exaggerate, it isn't 47,000, let's say it's 25,000, and let's say half of them are Hamas militants, that still leaves thousands of civilians dead. I don't know how people can be okay seeing Palestinian children brought from rubble. This is just an absolute nightmare for the Palestinian people. And yes, Israelis living in border areas have the constant threat of air raids. They go into air raid shelters. They're also traumatized, but I don't think it's on the same scale as what the Palestinians have been through. 1,200 Israelis died on October the 7th. It was an appalling atrocity, but that's been multiplied many times over since then. The only way this ends is, I mean, it's great that that ceasefire was brought about, and both the Biden and Trump administrations are claiming credit. Probably both deserve some credit, but Trump is definitely 100% pro-Israeli. So if there's a future flare-up, I can't see Trump being part of the solution. Um, what I really resent is this idea that if you have concern about Palestinian civilian deaths, or you criticize Israel in any way, shape, or form, you're somehow being pro-Hamas or even an anti-Semite. I abhor anti-Semitism. I've always rejected anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And one reason for that I would point out is that there are Jews and Israelis even who are critical of Israeli policy. Um, some of the most benevolent, open-minded people I've seen have been Jewish people. But frankly, there is a very right-wing pro-Israel lobby in this country and in the United States that thinks there should be no limits on support for Israel. That thinks there should be an absolute green light for Israel to do as it pleases. And sometimes they'll put this caveat, oh, we don't believe Israel's above criticism, but essentially they are demonstrating that. I mean, it's very, very, very difficult for either the government or other players to take a neutral stance on this. Take the BBC, for example. The BBC has been utterly condemned by pro-Israelis early on when they refused to use the term terrorist. I do think that was a mistake. But the interesting thing is, roughly an equal amount of complaints have been levelled at the BBC for being too pro-Israel. So what is the BBC to do? They've roughly 4,000 people complaining they're too anti-Israel, and roughly 4,000 people, those are roughly the figures, complaining that they're too pro-Israel. What are they to do? Um, I trust the BBC a lot more than I trust the Israeli Armed Forces outlets. I trust the BBC more than I would trust some of the right-wing outlets that are just blindly pro-Israel. I trust the BBC more than I would trust some pro-Palestinian sources. So I was critical of the BBC's failure to, call a terrorist attack, but I've got more sympathetic to the BBC because I think they're between a rock and a hard place on this. Um, I do think this is something that if the violence breaks out again, we'll have to see how it's instigated, if it's Hamas firing rockets or if they, carry out another atrocity like they did on October the 7th, or if it's Israel continuing to provoke the situation, for example, by aggressive actions in the West Bank. Um, as for Iran, it should stay the hell out of it. Iran is a toxic influence in the region, and that's another reason I'd be wary of some of these pro-Palestinian demonstrations. They're turning a blind eye to Iran's involvement. The Iranian regime doesn't care about Palestinians. The Assad regime certainly didn't. But I will be honest, I've got a bit fed up with pro-Israelis who just seem to have this callous disregard for Palestinian civilians. Or they'll say, it's all the fault of Hamas. I hold Hamas responsible for its own actions, but I hold Israel responsible for its decision to have basically a scorched earth campaign. And it's a bit absurd to say, well, we're giving you warnings to leave these buildings because we're going to bomb it. But where the hell are these people supposed to go? Going to so-called safe zones that then also get bombed. So it's a bit of a cruel joke, really, to say, oh, well, we give them fair warning. And I suppose it's more than what Hamas does, but is Israel really going to hold itself to the standards of a terrorist group? So personally, I cannot in good conscience just blindly support Israel anymore. I do condemn the mass killing of civilians. I condemn Hamas's actions. I cannot endorse what Israel is doing because I think it is morally indefensible. If Britain was totally cut off aid, it would be very controversial with the British right and the British pro-Israel lobby, but there may come a point where it's a justified thing to do. A lot of other European countries have done that. Doesn't mean that they're pro-Hamas. It means that they recognise the enormous civilian suffering has to end. And the problem with Netanyahu's cabinet is it's full of hard right figures who are going well beyond self-defense and really do just believe in turning Gaza into real estate. I mean, the dehumanization of this war is really depressing. The dehumanization of Israeli Jews by Hamas, but also the dehumanization of Palestinians by pro-Israelis. It's very depressing. But what we're going to see, this is another reason I think Israel's approach is stupid, because they seem to think simply bombing Gaza to oblivion, killing thousands of people is somehow going to stop the situation. I think all it's going to do is breed future bitterness. If someone had lost their entire family to an Israeli airstrike, what's to say that person won't get radicalized and join Hamas? In all likelihood, they would, because they'll hate Israel. I think all this has done is polarize Israel in the world. I think it's went too far. I really do. Um, if Ukraine, to make an analogy, if Zelensky's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine was to immediately blitz Russian cities and then go into Russia, occupy Russian cities, murder Russian civilians, I'm not sure that it's supported. Say, yes, you have a right to fight back, but that's doing something else. Now, Ukraine did make an incursion into Russia strictly on a military level. Contrast that to what Israel's doing, which is basically collective punishment. It's hard to see it any other way. They can say that they're giving warning to Palestinian civilians, but sending down letters saying, "Leave your house, we're going to bomb it." Where are they supposed to go? I just find that um, doesn't sit well with me. Anyway, interesting results. But pro-Israelis cannot claim that the majority of Britons are pro-Hamas. Clearly, they're not. But it's also very obvious by this study that, and I imagine similar surveys would find similar results, that the majority of the British public are not enthusiastic about what Israel is doing. Doesn't mean that they're overly enthusiastic about the Palestinian cause, but clearly there's deep concern about civilian suffering. So I'm pleased that there is now a ceasefire in Gaza, but the violence continues in the West Bank and Lebanon. And it would take a really, really strong optimist to think that this isn't going to break out again, particularly when Hamas and Netanyahu are still in power. You have hawks on both sides. So I hope it holds, but we'll see. I hope the hostages can get their lives back together, and I hope the Palestinians who've been displaced have some glimmer of hope. At least with the violence over in Gaza, they can maybe get some semblance of normality back. But it's a horrendous situation. The people of Gaza have been through hell. I'm going to wrap this up.